Hello and welcome to this presentation on Decolonised in-betweenness, creative practice research made impactful. My name is Dr. Agata Rulkowska. I'm a senior lecturer in film productions at the Staffordshire University, and I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this MPE MEXA Practice Network Symposium. So, in order to make this presentation more structured, I decided to divide it into three main themes. The first one being the exploration of what creative practice versus research really is. So creative practice very often is being associated with being accessible, inclusive, versus research, which is often being associated with something very hermetic, exclusive, and often addressed or directed at the academia itself. The second set of questions or topic I would like to explore today is the decolonized approach to local knowledge, and by extension, decolonized approach to practice-based research. And in order to explore that, I'll be looking at a specific case study from one of my research projects. And finally, to wrap it up, I'll be looking at dissemination and impact, and I'll be pondering on the question of who could be the audiences for this kind of outputs where creative exploration meets academic rigor. Now, to start this conversation, I should mention that I spent about 20 years working with so-called fine art photography and installations, exhibiting those around the world, and also making short fiction films before I started using the films for research. Perhaps it started a little bit before, it kind of merged, but it really started with artistic background before I use it for research at all. Now, before I tell you what my research really is about, I presume it will be probably difficult for some people to realize which of these images are taken for purely artistic reasons and which ones are taken for research. And I find it rather fascinating, and a very similar thing happened with the videos, which I'll present in short fragments in a second. But of course, in terms of the way the things were done and approached, it was a very, very different process. Because for all the so-called artistic photography, I was working in a highly controlled studio environment. All the ideas were highly conceptual, and I spent weeks, if not months, exploring the best way to express certain ideas. And then I had a very highly controlled light situation. I was working with patient models, and I could redo my experimentations over and over again until I was pleased with the final outcome. Now, obviously, when it comes to using photography for research, the situation was very different because I was very much in this observational mode where I didn't really have much control over what was going on around me. But of course, it was very difficult for me to detach myself from my artistic background. So at least with photography, I was still trying to very much pay attention to the aesthetics of the images. So here is one of the images I did when I was working with the Kogi community in Colombia, another one with the Arhuacos in the same country, on the left-hand side Ecuador, and on the right-hand side the Yanesha community in Peruvian Amazon. Now, things became very interesting when I started using video for so-called artistic purposes. So what we are looking at right now is the fragment of a short fiction showreel I made. And as you can see, the images are highly stylized. I really worked very closely with the DOP. I worked with really good actors. The script was based on the literature, and I put a lot of attention when it comes to really creating the story in a visual way, in a way which won't be really possible for any future work with research. So I'm just gonna play a short fragment of that before we moved on to some examples from research videos. And now what we're gonna see is a big contrast with the previous work. So this is the research film I've mentioned, and I had to pay a big price to get really fantastic access to my participants, and that price was that I was my one-person crew when it came to filmmaking, which meant that not only I had to keep my eyes open to really observe what was going on around me and know where to go and when to switch my camera on. I was my camera person and I was my sound person, so obviously from the technical standpoint the film really suffered in comparison with what could have been achieved when if I worked with a proper crew. Nevertheless, I think it was a price really worth paying, because I really managed to witness some incredible things, and I would not really change the way I worked with the community. So let's just watch the final fragment.
Show that we care. It's not all about you, you know. It's not all about you, you know. It's not all about you, you know. It's not all about you, you know.
So let's just move on to the project itself. So just to give you a quick background, I worked with a small indigenous community in Colombia, which effectively became a communication collective called Decolonised. What really happened is the community was subject to violence and displacement due to a really difficult and sad situation in the region. And as a result, they decided to reach for filmmaking to communicate their worries and get some external allies. Now, as you can imagine, it wasn't an easy process, because we are talking about a community which really didn't have access to electricity at the beginning of the whole process. So obviously it wasn't easy. It also involved a lot of resistance from the elders of the communities, and training and funding and all the things which are needed to actually make a film. Now, as they progressed, as they started working on a second and a third and a fourth film, they started looking at the existing films made in the region by external filmmakers, and as a result, they started questioning Western politics of representations. And they started really working and fighting for this agency as people who can really represent themselves, and they really don't want anyone from the outside to help them with that. So we see very, very serious power struggles over there. Also, the question of ownership of the image. They really cared about what happens with all the videos and images taken in the region. They really wanted to know what happens with them afterwards. And effectively, they became what I like to call the voice of the voiceless. They were the one making the films about Western filmmakers, rather than Western filmmakers making the films about them, which was really fascinating. And 10 years fast forward, with their films being shown in international film festival, really very visible presence, they effectively became a sort of ambassadors of indigenous emancipation through the filmmaking. Now, what was my role in this project? It was rather complicated, and it really made me rethink my entire position as a researcher. So before going to Colombia, I of course done a lot of research trying to understand the situation, but and here there are some screenshots from what I've witnessed. I really understand how arrogant I was with certain pre-assumptions in relation to what I thought my participants would be and what they would want or not want to do. And it was really a fantastic learning, somehow frustrating, but really fantastic learning process. And this is when I became absolutely passionate, if not obsessed, with this idea of decolonizing local knowledge and really respectful attitude towards the participants and collaborative work, which really taught me a lot. And this is something I carry with all my future projects, which I'll mention in a second. So effectively, I spent nearly 4 months in the region, and I became a part of the filmmaking team for the Zigoneshi collective, I was traveling with them from village to village and helping them with the film they were currently working on, helping with translations, which I'll mention in a second, and really documenting the whole process for myself. But the more time passed, the more I realized that what the film I made as a result was about is not as much about them and their filmmaking process, but about myself as a researcher and my position with this kind of practice-based research specifically. And this is where all the things which followed, including my current PhD supervision and the things I'm really, really, really passionate about, stem from. So one of the things I wanted to touch upon in relation to this project was this idea of intercultural translations. So as I mentioned, this is an indigenous community, Arhuaco community with their own language. And one of the things I helped them with was translation and subtitles for the films they were working on. Of course, I was not translating from the Arhuaco, I was translating from Spanish to English, but it was really fascinating for me to work with them and really see how very often they would struggle to translate things from Arhuaco to Spanish, not because it was difficult for them, but because there was very often no equivalent in Spanish for the concepts, for the indigenous concepts they were trying to describe. So this idea of concepts and ideas and how they're being translated into audiovisual medium was rather fascinating, and also this idea of visual communication style and how they had to learn everything which could then be understood by external audiences. The second question was also this necessity to follow different time requirements. So the elders of the communities, so-called mamos, they tend to talk at length about really important subjects for the communities. So for the filmmakers, it was seen as a very bad and arrogant thing to do, to stop them and make them speak in a more concise way. But of course, for the filmmaking need, the need was to keep it rather short so it can be edited in for the final film, for the final cut. And the last question here is this question of understanding the audiences. So as I've mentioned, these films were really shown for external audiences in Western film festivals really around the globe. So they needed to understand the expectations of Western audiences. They needed to understand the questions of distributions, marketing, and all the things which are not very much in line with things they normally do on an everyday basis. So it was an absolutely fascinating thing. Of decolonization, what I have to mention is this incredible person, Pablo Mora here on the picture, who is an academic and filmmaker himself, but he is also the main link between the indigenous and non-indigenous world in terms of filmmaking in Colombia. And he was really fundamental in terms of helping the collective to do all the work they were doing with enormous respect and understanding for the whole process. And one of the things he said in relation to external films made in the region really made me think again back about this question of decolonization. And what Pablo Mora said is this: the author maintains the privilege of speaking through the voices, segmenting them, reorganizing them, mutilating them, distorting them, which is what is commonly used in halls of editing, without the uncomfortable presence of those represented, questioning the directors with their considerations on correspondence, truthfulness, and self-image. So just to wrap it up, I think it really is interesting to think about the audiences and people who can benefit from this kind of research. And I hope that anyone who is watching this video will agree with me that research is not just for academics, and it really should benefit society and contribute to knowledge. It should help us understand things. And I think it really creates this new potential for spreading the knowledge, spreading the news, spreading the research, and showcasing it to slightly different audiences through platforms, which luckily are becoming more and more popular and accessible. So I won't talk much about my current project I'm developing at the moment. I just want to mention that it's a project with small communities in South Pacific Islands, in collaboration with the University of South Pacific, and he looks at building long-term sustainable digital economies in collaboration with local communities, and really aims to drive both public and private investment in the creative economy in the region. So it draws on all the previous experiences with the attention to local knowledge and creative practice. One of the final things I want to mention is the examples of PhD projects I currently supervise. And the reason I want to mention those is because I find so much potential in practice-based research. And I really think it's really an amazing way for us to go forward with different kind of research, which looks at creative work, but not only. So two projects I'm particularly interested in here is this one on Kurdish cinema beyond victimhood, which is conducted by one of my PhD students who is a filmmaker himself from Kurdistan, and he's working on this idea of how sometimes a bit more challenging to do so. Now, I've mentioned many different amazing platforms and ways for us to disseminate practice-based research, but what I wanted to talk about here is the thing I conceived last year. It's the interdisciplinary festival and conference called Communities and Communication, which really was designed to bring academia and creative work together to discuss some very interesting and important subjects. So last year's theme was connections, and the response we got was really absolutely unbelievable. We got almost 2,500 submissions from 105 countries, and we had films, papers and posters and plenty of people attending the event, which really proved to me the need for this kind of discussion and the need to bring academia and creative world and also so-called general public together. And next year's edition is focused on the theme of diverse voices, and what I'm planning to do is to expand the submissions for any other non-conventional forms such as artworks, performance, and so on and so forth. And I'm really hoping to facilitate more discussions and more connections in relation to these two very important subjects. So really, just in conclusion, I just wanted to reflect back on one of the themes or topics suggested by the symposium, which is provoking practice, new forms of reach, impact and significance. So there's no doubt that the status of creative practice research is very complex and the outputs have their own challenges. But I also think it is very important to think about the context of disseminations, because it really matters. The same output will have a very different meaning depending if it's presented at the academic conference, art gallery, or perhaps a film festival. I really like to use and explore my in-between position of someone who emerged from the art world and ended up in academia to channel this tension to support my current PhD students. And I think there's lots of fantastic work happening at the moment, and I can think of many ways how we can enhance and support and really create a network and a community of people who work on this kind of research and really try to make the most of it. I'm also really very much interested in social-cultural impact on intercultural, interdisciplinary project. And I think it becomes particularly interesting right now in the post-pandemic or still pandemic world in relation to kind of digital worlds and connections. I think there's lots of potential over there. I'm also very much interested in ethical position of politics of representation, and arguably any kind of creative work is about representation. So I think it's something really important, and there's lots of ethical weight applied to it. And this idea of cultural and methodological hybridity, which really in other words can be described as freedom. And so these blurring boundaries between art world and academia, where creative world, creative explorations meet academic rigor, creates a really new, fantastic opportunity for us. And I'm so excited to look at new approach to also measuring impact, because that's obviously something which is very important both for the society and for us. So in conclusions, I'd like to say that importance lies in tuning into local perspectives as opposite to giving voices, because those voices already exist, and looking at collaborations on equal rights. I really have no doubt the practice, both in terms of the process and the final artifact, lead the way to answer questions in a very effective and fascinating way, and hopefully outcomes could become more accessible and relatable to general public. And there's amazing possibility for us to explore new ways of dissemination with more and more platforms available to disseminate this kind of work. So thank you very much, and I'll be absolutely delighted to hear from anyone interested in similar research. This is my email, my website, and very easy to remember Twitter handle, following Gret. So thank you so much, and I look forward to hear from anyone, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you so much.